Well, good evening, everybody. Thank you all very much for coming. Appreciate your continuing support and your continuing interest in what we do here at the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice. And my name is Tom Morgan, and I am the director and have been for some time. This lecture this evening, like so many of them, is sponsored by the Alworth Center for the Study of Peace and Justice at the College of St. Scholastica and funded in part by the Warner Lecture Series of the Manitou Fund, the DeWitt and Carolyn Van Everen Foundation, and by Mary C. Van Everen in memory of William Van Everen, a former trustee of the college. Additional support has been received from the Global Awareness Fund of the Duluth Superior Area Community Foundation, by Reader Weekly of Duluth, and from numerous other private donors. Thank you to all of you for your support. These wouldn't happen without the support of everybody, and particularly by the leadership of the Alworth family. This is the fourth in a series of 5 programs we're doing this year under the title of Voices of America. And the 5th one is the end of the month. Somebody that I think most of you probably know, or at least know of, will be speaking about indigenous issues. I'm calling the title The State of American Indian Nations, and that's Karen Diver will be here for that. Another program I should promote, and this has nothing to do with the Alworth Center, but there should be some flyers about this out there, and that is a lecture in connection with our Francis X. Shea Memorial Lecture Series. Noted poet Dr. Coleman Barks will read selections of poetry by 13th century Persian mystic Rumi, and his reading will be accompanied by sitar and tabla, and a discussion of the significance of the poetry. That is Thursday, April 6th, and there are flyers out there about this. There are also a couple of tables out there by organizations that are promoting causes that I think are very much in keeping with the message of our speaker this evening. There's a table from Veterans for Peace out there, and you can have a look at that and see what that's all about. And there's also some information from Witness for Peace. A number of people from the Twin Ports have been participating and have participated in Witness for Peace delegations to Colombia, Nicaragua, Mexico, Cuba, and Honduras to learn about conditions in these Latin American countries and how U.S. government policies and corporate practices have impacted them. So there's more information about Witness for Peace and upcoming delegations. Of particular note, there's a delegation for Honduras in late May, led by Meg Crouch and Lynn Clark Pegg. And there's a delegation to Colombia in June, co-led by our speaker this evening, Aviva Chomsky and Steve Striffer. So that information is out there as well. On the screen to your left, we're displaying the text of tonight's lecture through technology called real-time captioning. Although we anticipate a high-quality format, there will inevitably be errors that are inherent to this technology. Nevertheless, research indicates that many viewers benefit from captioning, including those with hearing loss, of course. A special thank you to the Edwin H. Eddy Foundation, whose generous support makes this inclusive service possible tonight. After the lecture, of course, we'll have a Q&A, and we have 2 microphones right here, and I invite you to come to the microphones. Keep your questions short, crisp, and to the point, not another speech. And our speaker will be delighted, I know, to answer your questions. And please, you community people, defer to the students. Give them a chance to ask the questions first, and then I'm sure we'll have time for community people as well. Following this lecture, on Thursday evening, today's Tuesday, so it'd be Thursday, we have one of our talkback sessions. This one is at First Lutheran Church, and will be led by Chris Davila, one of my colleagues here at St. Scholastica, who does know something about diversity and cross-cultural issues. His biography and information about him is on this flyer. I think you all have it. We invite you to come to that, and thanks to the folks at First Lutheran Church for making that space available to us. Thursday evening, 7 p.m. We're going to talk about Professor Chomsky when you're not here on Thursday evening, right? So just be ready for that. The vibes will be there. One last announcement is routine announcement is if you have telephones or machines that squawk and beep and all that, please turn them off so we can give our full attention to our speaker, who is a teacher, historian, author, and activist. She is professor of history and the coordinator of Latin American, Latino, and Caribbean Studies at Salem State University in Massachusetts. And she's a member of the North Shore Columbia Solidarity Committee. Back in 1976-77, Professor Chomsky worked for the United Farm Workers Union. She credits this experience with, as she puts it, sparking her interest in the Spanish language and in how global economic forces affect individuals and in how people collectively organize for social change. She was awarded her PhD in history by the University of California at Berkeley in 1990. She received the 1997 Best Book Prize from the New England Council of Latin American Studies for her book West Indian Workers and the United Fruit Company in Costa Rica, 1870 to 1940. The book describes how workers developed their own socioeconomic system that paralleled the system created by American business interests. Her recent scholarly work has been in three main areas: the Cuban Revolution, Northern Colombia's coal industry, and immigration and undocumentedness in the United States. Her book, Linked Labor Histories, looks at globalization as a long historical process with labor history at its center. She's recently published a brief analytical college-level text on the Cuban Revolution, as well as 2 books on immigration. One of them is They Take Our Jobs and 20 Other Myths About Immigration. And the second one that I am reading with a lot of my students, Undocumented, How Immigration Became Illegal. And that second book will be on sale after the lecture, and if you play your cards right, I think you can get Professor Chomsky to autograph it for you. She's also edited several other books dealing with these topics. She's contributed chapters to still other books, and she's written numerous articles for scholarly and general interest publications. Her current research weaves together labor and environmental histories, focusing on a region of Colombia where indigenous and Afro-descended people have long evaded state control. But when she's not thinking about these serious and complex topics, she enjoys the great outdoors, biking, hiking, and taking it all in, and also reading fiction. Ladies and gentlemen, please welcome Professor Aviva Chomsky.
Thank you. Thank you for that lovely introduction. I always love to hear my career sound so coherent. It never felt that coherent to me, but when I hear you put it that way, oh, that all makes sense. That's what I did, that's right. And thank you all for coming tonight. Thanks to everybody who contributed to organizing this lecture. I know a lot of work goes into making these things happen. Can everybody hear me? Am I close enough to the mic? Yes? A little closer? Okay. Is this better? So my topic tonight is justice and U.S. immigration policy. And obviously this is a very propitious moment in U.S. history to be talking about this issue of justice and U.S. immigration policy. What is a just immigration policy? I think probably right now, more than at any other moment in my life, large sectors of the U.S. population are asking this question, what is a just immigration policy, and coming up with very, very different answers. And one of the things I'm trying to do in my current work is make sense of these very different answers. How can different people have such very different ideas about what justice is? And I think part of the answer to that comes from the knowledge, partial knowledge, and assumptions we have about our own history as a country. That what we think is just is shaped and formed by how we understand our history. So I just want to pause and make sure that I'm close enough to the mic now. Yes? Can everybody hear me good? Well, okay. So I know that you had a speaker about a month ago, Philip Cafaro, who raised certain issues, especially about environmental impacts of immigration, economic impacts of immigration, and I'm not really going to focus on those tonight because I'm going to be talking more about how our understanding of the history shapes the way we think today. And I'm going to suggest that we have to radically change the way we see our history, the way I was taught the history, the way probably most people or all people in this room were taught the history, not only in the classroom, but it's a historical narrative that permeates every level of our society. We breathe it in with the oxygen we breathe from the minute we're born or from the minute we arrive in this country. It permeates the way we think. And I'm going to ask us to radically rethink that. But I also did just want to mention that these issues of the environmental aspects of immigration or the economic impacts of immigration, I actually did write about a lot in my first book, They Take Our Jobs, and 20 Other Myths About Immigration, and I'm happy to answer questions about that too. I hope I can enter into a sort of a dialogue with the previous speaker as well. So I would like to propose that there is a master narrative, this is a phrase we historians like to use, that describes a framework that, as I was just describing, that permeates the way we think, that permeates popular culture, the media, classes. I took classes in immigration history, and this is what I was taught in my classes in immigration history. But even without taking classes in immigration history, you are exposed to this narrative just by virtue of being in this country. That's what we mean by a master narrative. And the master narrative can be summed up perhaps in one phrase: this is a country of immigrants. I challenge anybody in the room to say they've never heard that said. Have we all heard it? This is a country of immigrants. But I actually want to challenge that notion and ask us to think a lot more deeply about what we mean when we say it. What does that statement reveal, and what does it obscure? So instead of starting out by saying, this is a country of immigrants, I start out by saying, is this a country of immigrants? So I'm going to begin by going over a sort of an exaggerated version of the master narrative, where by exaggerating it, I hope I will make obvious to you as I go along, or at least suggest a few questions as I go along about what might be wrong with this master narrative. And to make it even easier for you to think critically about the master narrative, in addition to slightly exaggerating it to make it easier for you to notice what's wrong with it, I put 3 examples at the bottom of the outline about what I think is wrong with the master narrative. I think there's 3 areas in which the master narrative is deeply flawed and which make it hide as much or more than it reveals. And those 3 areas are race, geography, and labor. So I'm going to go through each piece of the narrative, and there's 4 parts to it. Historians like to periodize, so we divide our immigration history into 4 periods. So I'm going to go through each of these periods, and after I describe it, I'll just pause to ask what's wrong with the picture that I've been drawing, which I am fairly confident is going to be a picture that all of you have been exposed to before in one form or another, either directly or indirectly. So let's go through the master narrative. It begins with about the first 200 years of American history, starting in the early 1600s and ending in the mid-1800s, so approximately 200 years. This is what immigration historians call the period of the old immigration. And the old immigration, according to the master narrative and immigration historians, has several particular characteristics which make it different from the periods that follow. The old immigration was primarily English, and that means by nationality and by language. The immigrants came from England and they spoke English. They were primarily Protestant. They came to the East Coast of the United States. That generally goes without saying. It's just sort of taken for granted that we're talking about immigrants who come to the East Coast. They came in family groups, and they came with the intention and then carried out their intention of forming small agricultural self-sufficient villages that basically, in terms of labor, people produced what they consumed. They farmed, they made their own soap, there was a blacksmith who made pots and horseshoes, and there was a baker who made bread. They were farmers and artisans, and the villages were self-sufficient. They essentially produced what they consumed. And they came seeking religious freedom, if we want to talk more about religion beyond just saying that they were Protestant. Is this a narrative that everybody has kind of heard? Okay, so if we think about what's wrong with this narrative from the perspective of race, geography, and labor, I would suggest that this narrative is, without explicitly saying so, it's a narrative about white people. It's a narrative that privileges white people and, at the same time, obscures or erases the histories of people of color, who of course did have histories during this old immigration. It obscures and erases the history of the native peoples of this country by suggesting that the history began in 1620. It began when white Europeans started to arrive. And it also obscures the history of the Africans who were not immigrants. And this came up for debate right specifically today when Ben Carson suggested that African immigrants came over on ships and has been resoundingly denounced on social media for suggesting that the enslavement, forced capture, and transport of Africans was the same phenomenon as immigrants coming to America to seek a better life. So if we look at this narrative by placing race at the center of our thoughts, we notice that this is a narrative, this is essentially a white supremacist narrative, the narrative of English immigration, and placing that narrative as the history of the country. The narrative is also problematic from the perspective of geography, as I suggested a moment ago. That is, the United States covers a very large territory. The history of the United States is more than the history of some English colonists in a small band along the East Coast between 1600 and 1850. Lots of things were happening in other parts of what is today the United States between 1600 and 1850. And those parts of America were not English. They were not primarily white. So geography and race kind of overlap when we look at what's wrong with the narrative. And finally, labor, by emphasizing English immigrants and their self-sufficient villages, we are once again erasing the labor of people of color who were brought here by those English people to produce plantation products for export primarily. So we're telling one piece of the history and saying that it's the history. And our decision about what is the history of immigration that allows us to say that this is a country of immigrants is a very racially problematic decision. Okay, let's move on to the second period, the period that immigration historians call the new immigration. And they call it the new immigration because they started developing this narrative in the 1940s and 1950s. So at that time it was new. It's not really new anymore, but it was called the new immigration at the time that immigration historians started writing this history, and we continue to use the term. The new immigrants start to come around 1850, middle of the 19th century. And so now I'm returning to the master narrative, and then we'll critique it after I tell it. So the new immigrants, instead of coming from England, goes the master narrative, came from the peripheries of Europe. They came from Italy, they came from Poland, they came from Greece, they came from Turkey, they came from Russia. So they were no longer English speaking. And they no longer came from England. They were also no longer Protestant. These new immigrants who start to come around the 1850s are Catholic, they are Orthodox, they are Jewish, but they're not Protestant. And their labor is very different too. That is, instead of coming to found small farming villages, most of these new immigrants come to work in the burgeoning factories of New York, of Boston, Philadelphia, Baltimore, initially, and then moving into the cities, the industrializing cities of the Midwest. So this period of the new immigrants goes from about 1850 until the 1920s. So approximately 70-year period of the new immigration. Is this also a kind of familiar story? This is when the Statue of Liberty is erected in New York to welcome new immigrants with her torch. This is when Emma Lazarus writes her stirring lines about, "Give me your tired, your poor." Familiar story? Okay. But this story too, this period too, this way of telling the narrative too, I would go on to say, is also problematic in some of the very same ways that the story of the old immigration is problematic. That is, these peripheral Europeans, if we want to call them that, the Irish, the Italians, the Poles, were not the only immigrants coming into the United States at this time. Does anybody have any suggestions about who some other immigrants were who were coming into the United States? Chinese. Okay, Chinese. The Chinese were coming into the United States, but they were not welcomed in New York with the Statue of Liberty and the words of Emma Lazarus. On the contrary, they were prohibited and banned and stopped as they arrived on the West Coast in Angel Island in California. By 1880, Chinese migration had been completely prohibited. So Chinese immigration was not welcomed European immigration was welcomed, but Chinese immigration was not welcomed. And I'm going to talk a little bit more about why and how this fits. Any other immigrants who were coming during this period, 1850s through 1920s? Did somebody say it? Mexicans? Mexicans were also entering the country in large numbers, but they also were not considered welcome immigrants. They were not coming across the sea to New York. They were coming across the southern border. The Chinese and the Mexicans were not going to the factories of the East Coast. They were creating an economy in the West. They were building railroads, they were working in mines, they were working in agriculture, very crucial sectors of the US economy, but sectors that are left out of the master narrative because of the way that race and geography shape a master narrative that focuses on white immigration. And I want to say one thing more about this word immigrant and immigration here. An immigrant is somebody who comes to a place in order to stay, in order to become part of the society. If you go to study in Ecuador, you do not get an immigrant visa to go to Ecuador, you get a student visa to go to Ecuador because you're not permanently moving to Ecuador to become an Ecuadorian, you're just going there for a year to study. Likewise, if somebody comes to the United States, there's many, many, many different kinds of visas that exist. Only a very few of them are immigrant visas. Those are the people who are approved to enter the United States to become citizens and stay. During all of this period that we're talking about, only white people could be immigrants to the United States because only white people could be citizens of the United States. Therefore, the Chinese and the Mexicans were not considered immigrants because by not being white, they could not be citizens. And of course, again, we have race, geography, and labor intertwined in the narrative that we tell and in how we need to critique that narrative. Okay, third period, according to the master narrative, begins in the 1920s and lasts until 1965. According to the master narrative, this is the period of immigration restrictions. Look at any US history textbook and it'll say immigration restrictions start in 1921, 1924. This is when we restricted immigration. This is the period when quotas were implemented, drastically reducing the number of European immigrants who were allowed to come into the country. These immigration restrictions did not affect Asians, who had already been prohibited long before from entering the country, and they did not affect Mexicans, who I'm going to talk more about later and explain why. But when we talk about this as the period of immigration restriction, once again, we're telling a narrative that implicitly accepts the idea that immigrants are white people. So this is the period in which US law restricted white people from immigrating to the United States. The last period of immigration history starts in 1965. When the restrictive numerical quotas of the 1920s are dismantled. And according to the master narrative, according to your US history textbook, according to US immigration historians, 1965 opened immigration to the entire world once again. Got rid of restrictions and created this open immigration system that we live under today. I'll just leave you with that, because now I'm going to go over everything that's wrong with the narrative. We're going to go back and tell the whole history again from a different perspective. So in order to do this, I want to go all the way back to the founding of the country and suggest that by defining immigrants as white people and by being utterly determined to create a white country, our founding fathers were great advocates of immigration. Because immigration, that is, bringing more white people into the country, was the only way to create a white country in a land inhabited primarily by people of color. And I want to illustrate this by going back to the Declaration of Independence. Everybody knows about the Declaration of Independence, right? Everybody's read bits and pieces of it, but rarely do our textbooks zero in on the part that I'm going to focus on here today, which is the middle paragraph. The first paragraph probably sounds kind of familiar to you. The history of the present King of Great Britain is a history of repeated injuries and usurpations, all having in direct object the establishment of an absolute tyranny over these states. To prove this, let facts be submitted to a candid world. That's the introduction to the Declaration, and then it goes through and it has the bullet points where it lists all the terrible things that King George did, all the tyrannical things that have forced the colonists, or colonizers we could call them, to fight for their independence. But I want to zero in on one of them. He, that is referring to the king, he has endeavored to prevent the population of these states. For that purpose, obstructing the laws for naturalization of foreigners, refusing to pass others to encourage their migrations hither, and raising the conditions of new appropriations of lands. So I want to make sure everybody follows exactly what is being said here, because it's very, very crucial. In 1763, the King of England passed the Proclamation of 1763, which attempted to recognize the rights of the native population of the colonies. To recognize native rights to their land and to cut back on their colonial project. That is, to slow white migration and to guarantee native rights to their land, to draw a line saying white colonial project ends here and the rest of the land remains in native hands. And in order to do that, white migration had to be slowed, because as white migrants are pouring into the colony, they are taking more and more and more native land. So the Proclamation of 1763 tried to slow down this process. And the colonists didn't like that one bit. They wanted more white foreigners to come in, to increase the white population, and to guarantee the right of white immigrants to displace and dispossess the native population. So one of the principal causes of the so-called American Revolution was actually outrage at the British attempt to slow the colonial project. The American Revolution was unlike any other anti-colonial revolution that has happened in the history of the world. Every other anti-colonial revolution has been carried out by the people who were colonized by Europeans, kicking out the European colonizers and declaring independence for the original inhabitants of the land. You look at anti-colonial movements in Asia, anti-colonial movements in Africa. The goal was to kick out the European colonizers. The American Revolution was a revolution by the European colonizers, not to kick out the colonizers. They were the colonizers. They wanted to expand the colonial project. It was a pro-colonial revolution, not an anti-colonial revolution. And immigration was a key aspect of the colonial project. Does everybody follow this? Okay. So this commitment to forming a white country on native land is further implemented through legislating citizenship during the first 100 years of the country's history. So in 1790, the U.S. Congress, the new U.S. Congress, passed an act to establish a uniform rule of naturalization. Naturalization is the method by which people who are not citizens become citizens. And remember that one of the complaints in the Declaration of Independence was that the king made it too hard for new immigrants to become citizens. The new leaders of the country wanted to make it as easy as possible for new immigrants to become citizens, because new immigrants were white people, and that's what they wanted their country to be made up of. So, be it enacted by the Senate and the House of Representatives of the United States of America, in Congress assembled, that any alien, being a free white person, who shall have resided within the limits and under the jurisdiction of the United States for the term of 2 years, may be admitted to become a citizen thereof. It was really easy to become a citizen. They made it as easy as possible for white people. All you had to do was be white, come here, and be here for 2 years, and you're a citizen. No lines to wait in, no forms to fill out, no tests to take. Being white was all it took, because the goal was to encourage as many white people as possible to come to create a white country. Now, this changes somewhat. The way that citizenship is legislated changes after the Civil War. After the Civil War, there is a general acknowledgement of the crime of slavery and of the need to create some kind of compensation for those who were enslaved in Africa and for their descendants in America. So the 14th Amendment to the Constitution is passed that opens up citizenship beyond white people for the first time. The 14th Amendment creates this radical new concept called citizenship by birth. Now you become a citizen not by being white, but by being born in the United States. Now we're so used to that, it seems obvious that that's how citizenship is obtained. But this was new at the time of the 14th Amendment. And it still does not exist in all parts of the world. That is, you don't automatically obtain citizenship by birth everywhere, but you do in the United States, at least for now. So let me read this to you. It begins with a very clear word, all. We all know what all means, right? It means all. But watch out, it doesn't really mean all, not in this 14th Amendment. All persons born or naturalized in the United States. Still sounds like all, right? But now comes the qualification, so it's not really all, and subject to the jurisdiction thereof. Who is not subject to the jurisdiction of the United States? Native Americans. Citizenship by birth does not apply to Native Americans. So it starts with the word all, but it very quickly says, but we don't really mean all. Don't get us wrong. All persons born or naturalized in the United States and subject to the jurisdiction thereof are citizens of the United States and of the state wherein they reside. So they say all, but what they mean is white people and people of African descent. And that's why there's the qualification. And the fact that this is what they mean becomes even clearer when you look at the Naturalization Act of 1870. 2 years after the 14th Amendment, the Naturalization Act is also rewritten to acknowledge the evil of slavery, acknowledge the crimes done to Africans and people of African descent. The Naturalization Act of 1870 says, the naturalization laws are hereby extended beyond white people for the first time to aliens of African nativity and to persons of African descent. Now, these words look good on paper, but first of all, not everybody is either a free white person or an alien of African nativity or a person of African descent. That is, all of the other people entering the United States at this time, the Mexicans, the Chinese, for example, cannot naturalize. They are neither white people nor people of African descent. And just do a little thought process for a minute. How many Africans were coming to the United States in 1870 seeking a better life? You laugh. 0, right? After 3 centuries of forced capture, enslavement, and transport, for people in Africa, the United States does not look like a beacon of hope and a place to go for a better life. There is no immigration from Africa happening at this time. So the Naturalization Act allows Africans to naturalize, but there's no actual human beings who this act applies to, because migrants are coming to the United States not from Africa, but from Mexico and China, and they are not covered by the Naturalization Act. After citizenship by birth is established, though, we see a big change in treatment of immigrants. Because after citizenship by birth is established, citizenship cannot be restricted to white people unless immigration by non-white people is stopped. If only white people can be citizens, then it's fine for lots of non-white people to be around because they can never become citizens, so they can always be excluded, exploited, and oppressed. If non-white people can gain citizenship by birth, all of a sudden Congress says, oh, wait a minute, how can we keep our white country if we allow people of color to be here? We have to get rid of them because otherwise they're going to obtain citizenship by birth when they have babies, and then we won't be a white country anymore. So as soon as citizenship by birth is passed, Congress starts saying, oh, but we can't allow all those Chinese women to come into the country because they're going to have babies, and then we'll create a logical impossibility. We're going to have citizens who are Chinese who are racially ineligible to citizenship, but who become citizens by birth. So the entire notion of restricting immigration is a racial notion that comes about after citizenship by birth is created. And racial restrictions on immigration begin almost immediately. The very first one is not even on here, but it's in 1873, 5 years after citizenship by birth, and it prohibits the immigration, the arrival, the migration of Chinese women. A few years later, Congress sees that that's not enough. If they really want to prevent any Chinese or partially Chinese babies from being born, they also have to prevent Chinese men from entering the country. And the Chinese Exclusion Act of 1882 implements that. The exclusion of people from East Asia is expanded to other parts of East Asia. Basically, whoever tries to come is prohibited until 1917, when the Asiatic Barred Zone is declared. The Asiatic Barred Zone covers approximately 3/4 of the world's territory. It is defined as Asia. Asia includes the Middle East, it includes the Pacific, it just grows and grows until it covers practically everyone except for Europe, Africa, and the Americas. While this is going on, I just wanted to bring up one other group of people, and thinking about immigration and what it means to say we are a country of immigrants, and point out that in this period, as European immigration is greatly increasing, this new immigration from the peripheries of Europe, there are some other very important laws passed to foster European immigration. In particular, the Homestead Act of 1862 and the Dawes Act of 1887. These were two very crucial pieces of legislation that carried out wholesale dispossession of Native Americans from their lands in the South, in the Midwest, and in the West of the United States. So the new territories that the United States obtained after independence were very heavily populated by Native peoples. In order to replace those Native peoples with these white immigrants who are being encouraged to come and naturalize, Native lands have to be dismantled. And that is exactly what the Homestead Act and the Dawes Act did, was to take Native land and turn it over to white immigrants. So immigrants are still the privileged class because they are the white people. The 1924 Immigration Act, which did restrict immigration from those peripheries of Europe, those so-called new immigrants, did even more to Asia. It made permanent the Asiatic Barred Zone by saying that no alien ineligible to citizenship, and remember who's eligible to citizenship, it's white people and people of African descent, nobody else. So no alien ineligible to citizenship shall be admitted to the United States at all. So when we talk about the exclusions of 1924, rather than focusing on reducing the numbers of Europeans, we should also point out the racial nature of this law. That important provisions basically said that no non-European can come. Fewer Europeans can come, but no non-Europeans can come. So in my brackets at the bottom, basically European countries got quotas. Asia was defined as 3/4 of the planet's territory, and Asians were deemed aliens ineligible to citizenship. But here's the other part I promised I would get back to. Mexico and the rest of the Americas were not covered by the act. Mexicans were not restricted from migrating. In fact, after Chinese and other Asians were prohibited from migrating, Mexican migrant workers became even more necessary to the economy of the West and Southwest, to the building of the railroads, to the mining of the minerals, to the harvesting of the crops. Mexican labor was absolutely necessary. So we basically have 3 different immigration systems going on. Europeans are invited to immigrate, to be immigrants, to come and become citizens. Asians, this very, very, very large category, are prohibited entirely. Mexicans are brought to work and then deported. The deportability of Mexicans is built into the immigration history of the country all the way back to the middle of the 19th century. Mexicans are the perfect labor force. because it's easy to deport them before they can have babies and gain citizenship by birth. So you can keep this labor force as a second-class group of people who cannot become citizens, who can work, but who are not eligible to become citizens, because before they get to the point of doing that dangerous thing and having babies who will become citizens, we deport them. So the deportation of Mexicans is the third piece of this system, which is inviting Europeans to become citizens, prohibiting Asians from coming at all, and inviting Mexicans to work, but not as potential citizens, as deportable laborers. So again, remember, race, geography, and labor, we have to keep those three things in mind constantly when we're talking about immigration history. So this is my last slide, but I want to just look at this regime of inviting and deporting Mexicans throughout several centuries of US history and think about how it got us to where we are today. And then go back to my question of what is a just immigration policy. So 1848, people are probably vaguely aware, was what we call in this country the Mexican-American War, what the Mexicans call the War of the North American Invasion, where the United States conquered 55% of Mexico's territory. Two new countries that had recently obtained independence, the United States from England, Mexico from Spain. The United States invades Mexico, takes a little over half of its territory. And if you look at the debates in Congress, that is, the United States occupied all of Mexico, and they had to decide, well, where are we going to draw this new border? And it was very clear that Congress wanted to take as much land as possible with as few people as possible. They did not want those Mexicans in the United States, but they wanted the land and especially the resources, the mineral resources in the land. So the idea was take the land, not the people, and the new border between the United States and Mexico, drawn by the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, was very deliberately situated to take as much land and resources as possible with as few people as possible. Very shortly after this, the new industries that start to grow in this area, mining, railroads, and agriculture primarily, logging as well, start to import Mexican workers informally, and then by 1917, formally with the first Bracero program, a legal agreement between the US government and the Mexican government to bring deportable workers into the United States to send American recruiters. American recruiters were already going into Mexico to recruit workers. They were building railroads in Mexico to bring workers up to the border and across the border. This started way before the Bracero program, but it was done by private companies, by private enterprise, by private individuals, by mining companies, by railroad companies who were often the same. But with the Bracero program, the U.S. government gets in on the project of the state will finance, the U.S. state will finance the recruitment and transport of Mexican workers and their deportation to make sure that they don't stay. This is what the Bracero program is. In the 1930s, hundreds of thousands of Mexicans or people of Mexican descent, whether or not they're citizens, didn't matter. Mexican was a racial category. They were considered to be a mongrel race in the racial thought of the time, therefore ineligible to citizenship. If they were citizens by birth, they shouldn't be. Mexicans were so-called repatriated during the 1930s when their labor was not needed because of the Depression. During World War II, the second Bracero program is begun between 1942 and 1964. Hundreds of thousands every year are imported and deported, called a guest worker program. And this continues until 1965, Remember that date I mentioned on my very first slide as when our current immigration regime begins? 1965 ends the Bracero program, and for the first time places restrictions on Mexican migration. We're in the period of civil rights. We're in the period of the United States claiming to be overcoming racism, to be overcoming racist laws, to be treating all people equally, to be a beacon of democracy in the world. And the racial legislation that treats Mexicans differently from the rest of the world and treats Asians differently is dismantled. Now in 1965, says the law, we're going to treat every country equally. That means that every country will have exactly the same immigration quota. Nobody will be prohibited, but everybody will have the same quota. A quota of 20,000 per year. Now, think about what this means with respect to Europeans, populations devastated by World War II, a lot of very small countries with only a couple of million people in them, Luxembourg, Switzerland, Denmark, Belgium, Andorra. Every one of those countries gets 20,000 seats to come into the United States. And then think about countries like China or the Philippines, a former colony of the United States, Indonesia, India, countries with many, many millions of people, some of them up to 1 billion or more people now. Countries that have been prohibited from immigrating to the United States for many, many decades, they also get a quota of 20,000. This means that if you're a person in Luxembourg, by the way, a white person, it's really easy to get one of those 20,000. You can just come. Anybody from Luxembourg who wants to come is welcome. If you're a person in China or in the Philippines or in India or in Indonesia who wants to come, your chances of getting one of those 20,000 are almost close to zero. So countries are treated the same, but people are not treated the same. White people are still welcomed. So-called Asians are still not welcomed. But what about Mexicans? Now, instead of being legally welcomed to work and then go home, suddenly Mexicans can't come at all. 20,000 a year, where up until 1965, hundreds of thousands were coming to work every year. Well, the border isn't actually closed when this law is passed. The border is still wide open. Mexicans are still walking across the border very easily. But now there's a new name for them. They're not braceros. They're illegal because they're outside of that new number that has suddenly been imposed on Mexico. This means that they're still deportable. So the names change, the terminology changes, but the system continues exactly like it was before. Mexicans are invited into work, and then they're deported. It's just the rationale that's different. It's not a racial rationale now. It's not a bracero rationale. It's a rationale of illegality. And this is the regime of illegality that we still live under today. Illegality was a category that was created in order to discriminate against Mexican workers, in order to allow Mexican workers to be treated as no other people, as no other workers are treated, to make sure that Mexicans remained deportable. In an era where overt racial deportation was no longer acceptable. So, to go back to my question of what could be a just immigration policy? I think that I'm not going to tell you. You can ask me in the Q&A if you want, but I'm not going to tell you right now. But I want to leave you with the thought that in order to begin to answer that question, we need to acknowledge how much injustice has been built into our immigration system from the early 1600s until 2017. And unless we understand the fundamentally unjust basis of our immigration systems, our many systems that we have implemented over the course of hundreds of years, we can't even begin to talk about what would be a just system today. Thank you.
Good job. Now we invite you to ask questions, especially students. Please come forward and hold Professor Chomsky's feet to the fire. Ask her good questions.
I bet if a couple non-students ask, some students will come up after that.
Hello. Could you tell us your version of a just immigration policy?
Okay, so having already told you everything that I think is unjust about our immigration policy and its history and the deep roots of this injustice, I want to shift gears to talk about what would be a just immigration policy. And I want to shift gears by saying that anybody who studies immigration knows that the causes of immigration are structural and historical. We look at patterns. We look at when different waves of migrants have moved into different parts of the world. We acknowledge that ever since our human race first stood upright somewhere in East Africa many hundreds of thousands of years ago, we've been migrating. Migrating is in the human DNA. If we hadn't been a migratory race, and here by this I mean the human race, we would all still be in East Africa. So migration is part of the human condition. But there are structural and historical causes that have governed immigration waves when large numbers of people have moved from one place to another place. If we understand those structural and historical causes, then the idea of regulating immigration becomes much less obvious. That is, it's really only in the last 200 years that humans have decided that we can't just let all this migration happen without somebody trying to control it. Governments should control it. Every government should try to control where its people go and who comes in and out of these new borders that have been established mostly in the last 200 years. And that regime of nation states that define their sovereignty by, in part at least, by trying to regulate movement across their borders, has caused untold human suffering in the last 200 years. Because it doesn't acknowledge the structural and historical causes of migration. Mass migrations usually happen let's just look at what happened starting in the 1980s when the United States decided, okay, this open border thing isn't working, all these illegals are coming into the country, we're going to try to close the border. We're going to try to build a wall. We're going to try to patrol the border. The Border Patrol was created in 1924, but the purpose was not to stop Mexicans, because Mexicans were needed as workers and were deportable. The purpose of the Border Patrol was to try to stop Chinese from crossing the border into the country. So the Border Patrol never tried to stop Mexicans. They were there to try to stop Chinese who might try to come across the border between the US and Mexico. So it's really not until the 1980s that the Border Patrol is, in theory, trying to stop Mexicans from crossing the border. And especially in the early 1990s, as several Clinton-era policies are put into place to try to seal the border. What happened? Well, the number of undocumented people in the United States started to skyrocket after attempts to control migration began. The number of undocumented people in the United States began to skyrocket because once the border was closed, militarized, let us say, because of course it could never really be closed, but once the border was militarized, it became much more difficult to cross the border. That meant that people who for generations had been coming to the United States to work seasonally and then returned back to Mexico, it became so dangerous and so difficult for them to cross the border that they decided to stay. And they decided to bring their families. And they decided to have families here. So we see an explosion of the undocumented population as a result of US attempts to control migration, to control the border. Now, starting in 2008, with the economic crash in the United States, the Mexican migration started to shift. Mexicans were still crossing the border to come into the United States, but more Mexicans were leaving than were coming. Mexican migration has been at net zero since 2008. That is, as many are leaving as are coming. The Mexican population is no longer growing. And that has to do with the primarily economic reasons behind Mexican migration. Let me just mention one other economic, structural, historical cause of Mexican migration, of the increase in Mexican migration in the 1990s, in addition to the militarization of the border, which contributed to a huge growth in the Mexican population of the US, was NAFTA. In 1994, the North American Free Trade Agreement, which had devastating effects on corn farmers in Mexico, because part of the negotiations for NAFTA required that the Mexican government allow subsidized US corn to come into Mexico and flood the markets, and prohibited the Mexican government from supporting its own corn farmers. So the majority of Mexicans who were coming into the United States in the late 1990s are displaced poor corn farmers from southern Mexico, people who had never migrated to the United States before, start to migrate in the 1990s because of these structural historical reasons, not having anything to do with immigration policies or border policies. Now, Central American migration is responding to different structural historical causes, and it has not slowed since the 2008 downturn in the US economy. Instead, it has grown because Central American migration is responding primarily to violence and insecurity in what's called the Northern Triangle. Guatemala, Honduras, and El Salvador. Now, if you look back at the history of Central America, you can see, so why those three countries and not, say, Nicaragua? Why has there been such a drastic increase of violence and insecurity in those three countries in the 1990s, but not in Nicaragua. Well, if you go back a couple of decades, you may recall that Nicaragua had a successful revolution in 1979, and that the United States turned Guatemala, El Salvador, and Honduras into genocidal bloodbaths during those years, followed by the Central American Free Trade Agreement on the heels of peace agreements in El Salvador and Guatemala in the 1990s. So there are very strong structural historical reasons behind Central American migration to the United States that explain why some Central American countries and not others. So to finally answer your question, having gone on this long, a just immigration policy is a policy that understands that migration is the human condition, understands that structural and historical factors cause migration, and understands that migrants have human rights. Most migrants do not want to migrate. Most migrants would very much rather stay home. They're forced out of their homes by economic, political, and military security reasons. A just immigration policy would allow people to stay home by focusing on the U.S. foreign policies that have caused the conditions that force people to migrate. There you go.
My name is Ted. So my question is, do you think these acts, namely the Act in 1965, were created with the intention to abuse the Mexican migrant worker, or were they just misconstrued and then used to take advantage after lawmakers like maybe tried to make a fair law and then people just saw the loopholes in the uses?
Well, I think that the economic dependence of initially the southwestern portion of the United States, now the entire economy of the United States, on exploitable, deportable Mexican labor has been very deeply built in over several centuries. I don't think that the designers of this law specifically in a cynical and Machiavellian way said, oh, well, if we give Mexico 20,000, then we can call everyone else illegal and continue to deport them. I think they said, without taking into account the structural and historical causes of migration, because that's not how we're taught to think, they said, well, let's do something that sounds nice. Let's give every country the same quota. But they're saying this in a context where it clearly makes no sense, because of the economic dependence and because of the very strong economic interests that are clearly going to continue to use Mexican labor. So I think the answer is somewhere in between the two extremes that you gave. I think it has more to do with what we might call the ignorance of privilege, that allows you to say things that sound nice, but that by not acknowledging, not recognizing, not understanding the deep-seated inequalities allows them to continue.
Yeah, thank you.
Hello. The need for farm workers made it seem like there was a chance that this might all change in the organizing of the farm workers by Chavez and Huerta. There seemed to be a glimmer of hope there, and that seems to have been totally crushed. Can you address that, please?
Yeah. So I worked for the United Farm Workers, as Tom mentioned, in 1978, 1979. And when I decided, I was, no, not 78, 79, 76, 77. I started college in 1975, and I was in Philadelphia. And this was at the time when the United Farm Workers was trying to organize in grape and lettuce fields in California. And they had taken a kind of a leap from asking consumers to boycott grapes and lettuce that were produced by growers who were refusing to recognize the union and refusing to negotiate with the union. They took a kind of a leap in the mid-70s and started to target supermarket chains and ask supermarket chains to not carry grapes and lettuce by non-union growers. And this was a tactic aimed at pressuring those growers to recognize the union and to negotiate union contracts with the workers. So that was my introduction to the United Farm Workers. When I was in college, somebody came around the dorms asking us to go picket in front of Safeway to ask them not to carry non-union grapes and lettuce, and on like a Saturday afternoon, and I went, and I was really intrigued. And then I decided to leave college and work for the farm workers for a year. And I thought that I was going to be working on the boycott. But no, they sent us all out to California. And they sent us out to California to work on a political campaign called Proposition 14. It was a referendum, an initiative, a citizen initiative. And Proposition 14, so agricultural workers have never been covered by the National Labor Relations Act and protective labor legislation that was part of the New Deal in the 1930s, 1940s. Agricultural workers have been systematically excluded from every type of protective environmental labor legislation that's been passed in the United States. And this has been part of what has allowed the system of super exploitation of agricultural labor to go on, and part of what has made it so difficult to organize agricultural workers. So finally, in 1975, the United Farm Workers pressured the governor of California to create the Agricultural Labor Relations Act, a California version of the National Labor Relations Act that applied to farm workers, that created an infrastructure in which they could hold union elections, that required growers to negotiate with the union if it won the election. But the legislature didn't fund it. So Proposition 14, what I was unknowingly sent out to California to work on, was to require the legislature to fund the Agricultural Labor Relations Act. Guess what? We lost. We lost overwhelmingly. And the campaign against Proposition 14 was the first time that I was directly, personally exposed to this kind of racial hatred and racism in the anti-14 campaign. They showed TV ads of sinister-looking Mexicans going into people's houses and raping white girls and saying, if this law passes, Mexicans are going to be able to take your daughters, and because one of the provisions of the law was to allow union organizers access to the workplace, which the National Labor Relations Act does for all workers in all other industries, but this was sort of interpreted as like these racially suspect people are going to be allowed onto the private property of white people, and I mean, it was just incredible. So I just learned so much about this. But so the obstacles facing farm worker organizing are huge. And there have been repeated attempts in California, elsewhere in the country. Now agricultural work is performed by Mexican and Central American workers in Florida, in Massachusetts, in Connecticut, in Maine, everywhere in the country. But it's been extraordinarily difficult to shake the foundations of this system. And in fact, in many ways, it's gotten worse as the use of pesticides has increased, as factory farming has increased, and as the demand for cheap food and cheap processed food has increased. And that cheap processed food, whether you buy it at the supermarket or whether you buy it at a McDonald's, it's all produced by Latino workers. And that's why it's cheap. And there's just a huge consistency for keeping this food cheap. So there's many different factors that go into it, but the condition of agricultural labor in the United States is still horrendous.
Hi, my name is Jane, and I really want to thank you for this history lesson tonight. I mean, you've just made so much clear that has not been quite so obvious. And I heard I heard recently about a new documentary that's been made in California about the repatriation process. I'm sorry I don't recall the title of it, but it talks about many of these things. But anyway, what I wanted to say about that is that one thing they pointed out was that only the U.S. government can deport individuals. So the state of California and Texas called it repatriation because states and cities and counties could do that. And that's partly why the number is so high, maybe as many as 1 million, because it didn't take federal agents to do it. The state agents could do it. But Los Angeles has actually made formal apology for their part in it and erected a monument acknowledging that, which is, you gave me the background now to what I heard about that. The other thing that came to mind about using the word illegal, in that it's illegal to come and work, but not illegal until maybe recently to hire. So it just obviously is such a labor issue that is all the risk is on one side and all the benefit on our side. So after thanking you for that, I don't want to muddy the waters, but it seems like in our country we are so confused about immigration, and it's all mixed up with refugee now. And I don't know if you want to speak to that, but I think there's confusion over confusion, and who to let in, who to keep out, and where justice resides. Thank you. Oops.
So I have a couple of responses I wanted to make to some of the things you said, and then I'll quickly say something about refugees as well. Right now, we're seeing some very unusual and interesting things happen where cities like Los Angeles, which you mentioned, are actually objecting to federal deportation policies inside their cities. So we're seeing a lot of different layers of agencies with struggling with each other now. But regarding refugees, I could give a whole lecture just like this one on refugees, but I'll try to do it just really quickly. So U.S. refugee policy, as implemented after World War II, when the United Nations created a definition of refugee and obligated countries to offer refuge to people fleeing. The United States did not comply with international law on refugees. The United States created its own definition of a refugee. And a refugee in the United States until 1980 was a person who was fleeing communism. That's not what international law said about refugees, but that's what US law said about refugees. So refugees were people from the USSR, they were people from Vietnam, they were people from Cuba. And it's not until several lawsuits are brought in the 1980s that the United States is forced to start admitting that people who are fleeing other kinds of situations than communism can be considered refugees. So US refugee policy has always been highly politicized. The United States has never had a generous refugee policy. If you look at refugees from the Middle East today, the United States is, even though the United States sends more arms to the Middle East than anywhere else in the world, kills more people in the Middle East through drone and other attacks than any other country in the world, is deeply implicated in exacerbating all of the wars that are going on in the Middle East today, if not directly starting those wars, as in Iraq and Afghanistan. The United States has accepted only a tiny portion of the refugees who have been created from those wars, despite having far more responsibility for those wars than Jordan or Lebanon or Turkey, the countries that are accepting huge numbers of refugees. So while the January 27th executive order banning all entry by refugees for 120 days, which was then stopped by the courts and which was just reiterated yesterday. While that is terrible, I think we need to also contextualize by acknowledging that it's not like the United States had this really generous policy that all of a sudden President Trump wants to end. The United States had a very, very restrictive policy towards refugees, which has now been made even worse.
One more very concise question.
Not a concise one. Thank you for the talk. And if we could set aside the issue of what percentage of the migrant and refugee issues of the world are the United States' responsibilities or we are the instigator of, when you talk about a just policy that is considered our foreign policy, what would your idea of a fair migrant or refugee policy look like in practice? Not necessarily waiting for a utopian future when we have a brilliant foreign policy all the time.
So it's really difficult for me to accept the premise of your question. That is, I do not think that immigration policy can be separated from foreign policy. I think they're too deeply intertwined to say, well, let's just pretend that foreign policy doesn't exist. If foreign policy didn't exist, then the world we live in would be completely different and migration patterns would be completely different. So I don't really think we can analytically separate those two. But I think that a just set of policies would cease to murder people in their own countries or implement conditions that do not allow people to survive in their own countries. That would cause migration to go way down, and then nobody would have any objections to having open borders because a few people would want to come and visit. And all of the crisis that has been created about migration is caused by foreign policy. So I don't think they can be separated.
Thank you very much. Good job. We're right on time.
Okay.
I think they liked your talk. So, I cut off the public, pardon me, but I cut off the public conversation, but the private conversation can continue in the lobby for a while, and I'm sure you'll stay here and maybe sell a few books and continue some, bilateral discussion on these very topics. Thank you very much. Next up is Karen Diver on March 30th. Thank you all very much.